Some will tell you that knowledge is the ultimate source of power, but in the world's shadowed places, the real currency is secrecy. In the lethal ecosystem of organized crime, silence is more than a virtue. It is a shield and a blade. Victor Kalin, a man whose grip on the city's underworld was absolute and unforgiving, moved through the opulent restaurant with the divine certainty of a king. He believed he was utterly untouchable. His eyes passed over the woman attending his table, registering not a person with a life and a story, but a simple object, a functionary so far beneath his notice, she was practically invisible. He spoke to his companion in German, sharing a casual, cruel remark at her expense, entirely confident that her plain uniform signified an equally plain mind. He wanted her to feel small. He expected her to be afraid. His only requirement was that she perform her duties in complete, unnoticed silence. But Victor Kalin had just made a catastrophic miscalculation because he had absolutely no idea who this woman was. What happens when the creature you have dismissed as prey suddenly reveals the fangs of a predator? You are about to witness the answer, and the secret she is holding is about to bring his meticulously constructed empire crashing down around him. The Obsidian Lounge was less a restaurant and more a temple dedicated to wealth, a place where the very air was thick with the scent of old money and designer perfume. The lighting was a carefully engineered twilight, low enough to cloak secret handshakes and whispered threats, yet bright enough to catch the fire of the diamonds on every wrist. For Isa Corwin, though, it was just another night in a long, punishing war of attrition. It was only a Tuesday evening, but it felt as heavy and hopeless as the worst Monday. A throbbing, persistent ache started in the balls of her feet, a constant, painful reminder of the restaurant's mandatory 2-inch heels. Her starched, pristine white apron felt like a restraint, a set of chains that bound her to a life she was never supposed to live. This existence was an accident, a terrible deviation from her path. Just 3 short years ago, her universe consisted of grand lecture halls and ancient libraries, where she was on the verge of completing a distinguished degree in international relations at the prestigious University of Zurich. Now, her world had shrunk to the humiliating task of refilling water glasses for arrogant men who treated tipping as a performance of their own power. She drifted between the tables with her eyes locked on the floor, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, tight bun that hid her face. The hairstyle created a constant, pulling tension at her temples, but it served a vital purpose. It helped to soften the sharp, noble lines of her cheekbones, the kind of aristocratic features she now deliberately obscured behind stacks of menus and overpriced wine lists. "Table 4, Arthur, the floor manager, hissed as he scurried past. He was a man who seemed to be permanently sweating from a deep, internal anxiety. "That is the VIP section. You will not make eye contact. And for the love of all that is holy, Issa, try to move with a bit more purpose this time." Issa offered a brief, robotic nod, her grip tightening on the heavy silver tray laden with crystal water goblets. She did not need the warning. She knew precisely who was at table 4. She had felt his presence the second she entered the main dining room. The entire ambiance of the restaurant seemed to warp and bend, pulled into orbit by the immense gravitational force of one man. He occupied the semi-private alcove, perfectly framed by enormous floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed the glittering, endless tapestry of the Manhattan skyline. Victor Kalin sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 other men who were clearly not his dinner guests. They were his sentinels, their tailored Armani suits doing a poor job of concealing their true function. Victor himself was a man of cold, striking beauty. He had a jawline that could cut glass, eyes the color of winter ice that seemed to dissect everything they rested upon, and a posture that screamed of absolute, unquestioned dominance. He did not merely sit in the chair, he possessed it, transforming it into a throne. He was the unchallenged leader of the powerful Kalin Syndicate. On paper, his organization was a legitimate global logistics company, a massive enterprise that moved everything from luxury sports cars to heavy industrial equipment across continents. Beneath that respectable surface, however, it transported products that would never appear on any bill of lading. Issa neared the table, her years of training forming an impenetrable wall of professional calm. She placed the heavy water glasses on the fine linen tablecloth, her motions so fluid and silent, they were almost ghostly. "Would you be having sparkling or still water this evening?" she inquired, her voice intentionally kept level and empty of any personality. Victor did not even grant her a glance, his attention fixated on the illuminated screen of his phone, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. "Still," he commanded, dismissing her with a casual flick of his wrist, the exact same gesture one might use to wave away a fly. One of his men, a powerfully built brute with a nasty, jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, sneered at her with open contempt. His name was Stefan. "Bring the wine list," he barked. "The one for the expensive bottles." "Of course, sir." Issa turned to leave, but she lingered for just a fraction of a second too long. Her eyes were unintentionally drawn to the screen of Victor's phone. Displayed on it was a complex architectural schematic. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she quickly looked away, but it was too late. The image was seared into her memory. She recognized that layout with a sickening certainty. It was the high-security container terminal at the port of Hamburg. As she walked back towards the sommelier's station, the sophisticated symphony of the restaurant, the soft clinking of silver on china, the low, smooth melody of a live jazz trio, faded away completely. It was replaced by a roaring in her ears, the deafening sound of her own blood pounding. For 3 agonizingly long years, she had been a ghost, running and hiding from the brutal, unforgiving world that Victor Kellen ruled. And now, by some impossibly cruel twist of fate, she found herself standing mere feet from him, serving him a glass of water as if she were nothing. When she returned, accompanied by the wine expert, Victor was immersed in a low, tense conversation with Stefan. They ceased speaking the very instant they saw her coming. It was then, for the first time all evening, that Victor Kalen actually looked at her. His gaze was not one of curiosity or attraction. It was the cold, analytical inspection of a scientist examining a specimen. He took in every detail: her hands, worn from work, the slight, almost invisible fraying at the collar of her uniform, and the deep, permanent shadows of exhaustion under her eyes. A look of profound, undisguised disgust washed over his features before he turned back to Stefan. He switched languages as easily as he breathed, his voice transforming into the hard, guttural sounds of German. "A pretty shell, but completely empty inside," Victor stated, his tone dripping with the casual boredom of the ruling class. "She is probably as intelligent as a block of wood. These women all follow the same miserable path. They end up on their knees or begging for change on the street." Stefan released a low, rumbling chuckle of appreciation and took a long sip of his water. "Verschwendung," he answered, the German word for a waste, filled with utter disdain. A self-satisfied smirk played on Victor's lips. He was completely unaware that the supposedly simple-minded waitress, now pouring his expensive Pinot Noir, had spent her formative years speaking flawless German in the most exclusive boarding schools in Geneva. He continued his private discussion, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I want that shipment clear of customs before sunrise. If you get any trouble from the Meyer family near the containers at Dock 4, you have my full permission to burn them all to the ground. I do not care about collateral damage. I want the objective completed." Issa's hand remained as steady as solid rock. Not a single muscle twitched. She did not gasp or draw a sudden breath. She continued the act of pouring the rich red wine with the intense focus of a surgeon, filling each glass to the precise, correct level. But beneath that composed surface, a cold, hard rage was crystallizing in her veins. It was not merely his personal insults. She had learned long ago to expect that kind of cruelty from men like him. It was the name he had just uttered. The Meyer family. They were not just some anonymous business competitors. The Meyers were the very monsters who had stolen her family and left her an orphan. They were the reason she was now Issa Corwin, a humble waitress, instead of her true self. Isabella von Amsberg, the sole heir to a formidable shipping empire that had been systematically dismantled and utterly annihilated. Victor Collin was not just an arrogant, offensive patron, he was an active business associate of the very men who had murdered her father in cold blood. Issa gently placed the wine bottle back on the table, the condensation on the glass feeling like a shard of ice against her fingertips. In that singular, terrifying moment, two distinct futures stretched out before her. She could turn around and walk away, retreating back into the fragile safety of her hidden existence. Or she could strike a match and set this entire charade on fire. She raised her eyes and looked directly at Victor. He had already dismissed her again, expecting her to simply dissolve back into the scenery. Issa cleared her throat. It was a small, delicate sound, but in the abrupt quiet that now hung over table 4, it sounded as loud and sharp as a gunshot. Victor stopped, his wine glass poised halfway to his lips. He lowered it back to the table with deliberate slowness, his expression souring into one of pure annoyance. "Is there a problem of some kind?" he demanded in English, his words sharp and clipped like breaking glass. Issa straightened her spine. For the first time that night, she allowed the crushing weight of her exhaustion to fall away from her. She pulled her shoulders back and lifted her chin, her entire posture shifting in a way that was almost imperceptible, yet profoundly unnerving. The weary, invisible waitress vanished completely. In her place stood someone who held herself with the inherent regal authority of a queen forced into exile. She met Victor's gaze directly, without a trace of fear. The cold, arctic blue of his eyes seemed to collide with the raging inferno that now burned in her brown eyes. "Ihre Manieren sind so schlecht wie Ihre Einschätzung meiner Intelligenz," Isa said. Her German was flawless. It was not the clumsy, accented German of a student, but the crisp, cultured, high dialect spoken only by the European elite. The words translated to, "Your manners are as poor as your estimation of my intelligence." A deep, suffocating silence fell over the table. It was absolute and crushing. Stefan, in mid-swallow, began to choke violently on his water, sputtering and coughing into his napkin. Victor did not so much as twitch. He was utterly frozen, his hand clenching the delicate stem of his wineglass so tightly that his knuckles turned the color of bone. All the noise in the restaurant simply faded away. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation. It all dissolved into nothing, leaving a sharp, crackling silence between them. But Issa was far from done. She closed the distance between them, stepping deliberately into his personal space, a clear and calculated violation. "Und übrigens," she whispered, her voice a low, smooth threat, meant not just for him, but for every man sitting at his table. This was an act of rebellion from someone who was supposed to be powerless, a stark reminder that true power is what protects you. And in that moment, she had it. You have to wonder what pushes a person to such a dangerous edge. "And by the way," she repeated, switching to flawless English for the benefit of his company, her tone mocking their ignorance. "If your people hit Dock 4 tonight looking for a shipment from the Meyer family, they will be walking straight into an ambush. The Meyers use that dock as bait. They always have. Your actual cargo is already being moved through Rotterdam." She let the words hang in the air, a final cutting remark following. "But of course, you would know that already, if you were not so busy demeaning the waitstaff." Victor's face turned white, then a dangerous, blotchy red flooded his cheeks. He surged to his feet with such violence that his chair screamed against the floorboards, the sound so loud and jarring it silenced nearby tables and drew stares from across the room. Victor was oblivious to the attention. He loomed over her, a mountain of a man, radiating an aura of pure, unrestrained menace. "Who are you?" he snarled, his voice a low growl of rediscovered English. "Who had the nerve to send you?" Issa met his burning gaze without a flicker of fear. "Nobody sends me anywhere, Mr. Kalin. I am my own agent." She turned sharply on her heel, her dismissal complete, but his hand shot out like a striking snake, clamping around her wrist. His grip was a steel manacle, and the sudden shocking heat of his skin sent a jolt through her body, a dizzying cocktail of primal fear and sharp, focused adrenaline. "Let me go," she said, her voice impossibly steady. Her eyes traveled from his powerful hand, clenched tightly around her arm, and then slowly, deliberately, back up to his face. "Unless you want this to become a much larger scene, one that ends with the police arriving and finding that unregistered pistol you have secured in the left pocket of your jacket." Victor's eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. He dropped her wrist as if her skin had turned to fire. He could only stare at her, his mind struggling to assemble the pieces of an impossible puzzle. How could a simple waitress speak perfect High German, possess intimate knowledge of European shipping rivalries, and identify a concealed weapon from across a table? This was no waitress. He knew that now with absolute certainty. "You have to understand," Victor hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You just signed your own death warrant. No one learns about my business and just walks away." Issa gave him a smile that was utterly devoid of warmth, a chilling, empty gesture. "I already died 3 years ago, Victor. You cannot threaten a ghost." And with that final cryptic statement, she turned her back on him and strode away, her posture erect and proud, leaving the city's most feared criminals staring after her in a state of profound and silent shock. But the moment she was back in the loud, frantic chaos of the kitchen, Issa's iron composure finally cracked and fell away. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably, so violently that she had to brace them against a stainless steel counter just to keep her balance. She had actually done it. She had announced her existence to the entire Kalen organization. It was an act of stunning recklessness, a move so foolish it was practically suicidal. "Issa!" Arthur, the restaurant manager, rushed toward her, his face a mask of pure panic. "What in the name of God did you just do? Mr. Callan looks like he saw a ghost. He is demanding to see the owner right now." "I quit," Issa stated, her voice flat and hollow. She untied the strings of her apron, the symbol of her servitude, and tossed it onto the counter. "Mail my last check." Without another word, she grabbed her coat from a hook and fled through the rear service door. The cool, damp New York night air hit her face. She knew she had to disappear, and she had to do it immediately. It was time to become a ghost all over again. She understood the nature of men like Victor Kalin. He was a predator who would never let this insult go unanswered. She had just willingly painted a target on her own back. As she hurried down the dark, garbage-filled alley, she desperately tried to stick to the deepest shadows, avoiding the light spilling from the street lamps. She was so focused on escaping that she never saw the black sport utility vehicle waiting silently at the corner. She did not see the passenger door open or Stefan stepping out with a phone already pressed to his ear. "Boss," Stefan said quietly, his gaze fixed on Issa's retreating form. "She's making a run for it. Should we grab her?" On the other end of the line, Victor remained at the table, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Issa had been standing. He reached out and picked up the wine glass she had filled, turning it over and over in his hand, watching the light catch the deep red liquid. "No," Victor replied, a dark and unfamiliar obsession beginning to take root in his mind. "Do not take her. Follow her. I do not want a single scratch on her." A long pause followed. "I want to know who trained her." He considered the implications for another moment. "And Stefan." "Yes, boss?" "I need you to find out exactly how she knew about Rotterdam. If she was telling the truth, that woman just saved this organization $50 million. But if I find out she was lying to me, I will personally end her." Isla's apartment in Astoria was a carefully constructed shrine to a life of invisibility. It was located on the fourth floor of a miserable walk-up building, where the beige wallpaper was peeling in long strips, and the radiator groaned and clanged like a dying beast. This was the shell, but her true self was buried deeper. Beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom closet, a secret she had created 3 long years ago, were the only surviving fragments of Isabella von Amsberg. She collapsed onto her knees, a ragged sob catching in her throat, and furiously shoved aside the piles of her cheap waitress uniforms. Her trembling fingers found the hidden groove in the wood plank almost instantly, and she pried it loose. In the dark cavity below lay a waterproof duffel bag and a small, heavy metal box. With hands that shook, she opened the box first. Inside, there was a Swiss passport with a name she no longer used. Beneath it was a thick bundle of cash bound with simple rubber bands and a single, worn photograph. The image was of a man with silver hair and a stern, commanding gaze, standing on the deck of a yacht. His hand rested possessively on the shoulder of a teenage girl who was laughing, her face full of light. Hinrich von Amsberg, the celebrated shipping titan from Zurich, and his adored daughter, Isabella. "I am so sorry, Papa," she whispered, her thumb stroking the image of his face. "I made a terrible mistake. I let the anger win." She should never have confronted Victor Collin. She knew the cardinal rule of the shadow world she now occupied. Silence equals safety. To be seen is to be a target. But seeing him, the very man whose organization had allegedly orchestrated the corporate assault that drove her father to suicide, had shattered. Something fundamental shattered inside her, a breaking point she could not repair. Isabella shoved the photograph deep into her duffel bag, the image searing into her mind. She needed to be gone. The time for waiting was over. She knew that if Victor possessed even a fraction of the cunning she credited him with, he would not be searching for a simple waitress named Isla. His hunt would be for the anomaly, the piece of the puzzle that made no sense, the phantom haunting his perfect system. With frantic motions, she stripped off her work uniform. She pulled on a pair of dark, sturdy jeans, laced up thick-soled boots made for running, and disappeared inside an anonymous black hoodie. Her long hair came undone, a dark curtain to hide her features. A baseball cap was pulled down low, shadowing her eyes from the world. Gripping the bag, she moved like a ghost to the window. A window, her body tense as she peered through the grimy slats of the blinds. The street below was completely still, but it was a predatory silence, an unnatural quiet that screamed of danger. Nearly 3 miles away, at the very peak of the Kalin Tower, the atmosphere inside the penthouse office was electric with pressure. Victor remained a motionless silhouette against the vast window, his eyes locked on the sprawling, glittering expanse of the city he commanded. The reinforced glass could withstand a direct hit from a rifle, but at that moment, he felt completely defenseless. Standing behind him, Stefan's voice was a low, urgent murmur into his phone, each word tight with barely controlled panic. He finally disconnected the call, turning to face the unmoving shape of his boss. "The reports from Rotterdam are in," Stefan said, his tone grim, his voice heavy with the news. "It was 100% accurate, boss. Our contact at the port just confirmed everything. The Meyer family moved their heaviest hitters to dock for an hour before our team was supposed to arrive. They knew we were coming. It was a trap." The cold reality sank in. If our men had gone in, they would have been cut to pieces. It would have been a massacre. The real shipment, the priceless prototypes, had just cleared customs in Rotterdam, hidden under a shell corporation's name. Slowly, Victor turned away from the window. The familiar, hot rage that was his constant companion had disappeared, replaced by something colder, sharper, and far more lethal: intense curiosity. "She saved us," Victor said, his voice barely audible. A waitress, a woman serving drinks at the Obsidian Lounge, had just saved his enterprise $50 million and the lives of more than a dozen of his most loyal men. "Who is she?" Stefan asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "Is she a plant from a rival crew, some kind of spy trying to get on our good side?" "No." Victor walked to his desk, where a file lay open. Its contents were so thin they were an insult. "I had our cyber team do a full background search. Isla Corwin. Her social security number was issued 3 years ago, out of Ohio. Before that date, she doesn't exist. She is a complete ghost. No birth certificate, no school records, no tax history. The person known as Isla Corwin was fabricated in 2023. He picked up a grainy image printed from the restaurant's security feed. The picture was blurry, but her posture was unmistakable. The way she held herself, the confident angle of her chin, that was not the stance of someone paid to take orders. That was the stance of a person who was used to commanding a room simply by entering it. She speaks perfect High German, Victor mused, tapping a finger on her image. She understands the intricacies of our world. She understood the intricate internal logistics of the Meyer family's shipping operations, a topic no outsider should grasp, and she correctly identified the precise layout of the Hamburg terminal on my phone's screen, seeing it from 3 feet away while looking at it completely upside down. She has to be ex-intelligence, Stefan guessed, leaning forward. Or maybe ex-royalty, Victor countered, his voice a soft murmur. He picked up another sheet of paper from the stack on his desk. I had my team run facial recognition software, cross-referencing her image with every European database we have access to. The process took some time because she is much thinner now, and her face is harder. But look at this. He slid a glossy page, carefully torn from a magazine, across the polished desk. It was an article from Forbes Europe, published 4 years in the past. The headline was stark and brutal. The downfall of House von Amsberg, corruption, suicide, and the missing heiress. Stefan's eyes widened as he stared at the picture of the young, smiling socialite in the article. He then looked back at the grainy, haunted image from the security camera. Isabella von Amsberg, he breathed, the name a ghost in the room. The shipping heiress. The entire world believes she is dead. The official story was that she drowned herself in Lake Geneva right after her father's empire completely collapsed in a massive scandal. She did not drown, Victor stated with cold certainty, a dark, predatory smile just touching the corners of his mouth. She fled to New York. She went to disappear in a city so loud and chaotic that no one would ever think to look for her there. But why would she warn us? Stefan asked, completely baffled by the contradiction. The Collins Syndicate. We were the very ones contracted to tear apart her father's company. According to the official story, we are her greatest and most hated enemies. That, Victor said, rising from his desk and reaching for his coat, is the very question I plan to ask her in person. Get the car ready. And Stefan, I do not want the hit squad. I want the extraction team. If the Myers discover for a single second that she is still alive, they will undoubtedly finish the job they started 4 years ago. We have to reach her before she vanishes from the face of the earth all over again. Isabella managed to get 3 blocks away before the chilling realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was not escaping. She was being deliberately hurted. After exiting her apartment building through the damp silence of the basement laundry, she had emerged into the deep shadows of the back alley. She walked with determined purpose toward the nearest subway station, clinging to the comforting darkness, but the entire rhythm of the street felt wrong, discordant. A black sedan made a turn onto her street, moving far too slowly, its engine a low growl. A man dressed in a gray trench coat stopped suddenly to tie his shoe, taking an unnaturally long time to perform the simple action. She had been compromised. A cold, sharp spike of panic stabbed deep into her chest, sudden and paralyzing. She spun around, making a desperate, impulsive move into the bright, fluorescent lights of a 24-hour convenience store. A small, cheerful bell chimed above the door, announcing her frantic arrival. She hurried toward the back of the store, feigning a deep interest in dusty cans of soup, while her eyes remained fixed on the distorted, fish-eye reflection in the large circular security mirror mounted high in the corner. Outside, the silhouette of the man in the long trench coat waited, a patient predator lingering just beyond the safety of the glass door. She frantically searched for a way out, any second option. The store had a delivery door at the rear, but it was almost certainly locked and probably alarmed. Her hand dove into her pocket, her fingers wrapping around the cool, familiar metal of a small pepper spray canister. Laughably pathetic defense against the kind of professional killers who were hunting her. Still, it was the only weapon she had. She moved with sudden purpose toward the back room, pushing her way through the thick, swinging plastic flaps that separated it from the main store. "Hey, that is for employees only," a bored clerk called out from behind the register, not even looking up. "Bathroom!" Isa shouted back over her shoulder, not breaking her stride for an instant. She reached the heavy metal door at the back and slammed her palm flat against it. It was locked solid. A dead end. She threw her entire body weight against it, but the door didn't budge. The chiming bell from the front door sounded again. He was inside. He had not waited for her to come out. Without thinking, she grabbed a heavy plastic crate filled with soda, bottles, and smashed it with all her might against the industrial lock. The attack did not break the door open, but it did succeed in triggering the security alarm. A deafening siren immediately started to wail through the small store, shattering the quiet. Chaos had arrived, and chaos was her only ally now. She kicked the door again, a wild surge of adrenaline giving her a burst of hysterical strength. The latch finally gave way with a piercing scream of tearing metal. She fell forward out into the dark, wet alleyway, scrambling back to her feet in an instant. She began to run. She sprinted down the narrow alley, her feet splashing through murky, foul-smelling puddles, her breath burning like fire in her throat. Her only goal was to reach the subway. If she could just get down into the dark, sprawling tunnels, into the labyrinth beneath the city, she might have a chance to lose them. She burst out from the alley onto a main avenue, desperately weaving through the steady flow of late-night traffic. Car horns blared around her in angry protest. A yellow taxi screeched and swerved to avoid hitting her. "Isabella!" The voice cut through the noise of the city, and hearing her real name spoken aloud turned her blood to solid ice. It was not Isla. It was the name she had buried 4 years ago. She spun around, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A massive black sport utility vehicle had pulled up onto the sidewalk, completely blocking her path forward. The rear door slid open silently. Victor Collins sat inside, looking perfectly calm and composed. He was a figure of immense power and wealth, who seemed utterly alien amidst the grit and grime of this Queen's Street corner. "Get in the car," he said. His voice was not a shout. It was a simple, direct instruction, which made it all the more terrifying. "Go to hell!" Isabella gasped out, stumbling backward. "You have 2 choices. You can go to hell, or you can get in this car," Victor said, his voice rising just enough to be heard over the rapidly approaching sirens. "Now, look to your left." Isabella's head snapped to the left. Further down the block, a silver sedan was idling by the curb. Its back window was rolled down, and the sleek barrel of a suppressed submachine gun was clearly visible, catching the cold, metallic light from a nearby street lamp. "That is the Meyer family's cleanup crew," Victor explained calmly, as if discussing the weather. "They must have tracked your credit card when you entered the convenience store. They have no interest in talking, Isabella. They are here to eliminate a loose end. I, on the other hand, am simply offering to buy you dinner." Isabella looked from the menacing silver car to Victor. The door of the silver car was now opening. 2 men in dark suits were getting out, moving with deadly purpose. She had no choices left. Isabella lunged into the dark, cavernous interior of Victor's sport utility vehicle. "Go!" Victor commanded his driver, his voice sharp and final. The man floored the accelerator without a moment's hesitation. The tires shrieked in protest, burning thick rubber on the pavement as the massive vehicle launched itself forward, aggressively cutting its way into the flow of traffic. The move came just a fraction of a second before the first bullet struck the ground, sending up a shower of bright sparks from the exact spot where Isabella had just been standing. The journey into Manhattan was conducted in absolute, suffocating silence. The windows of the huge vehicle were tinted so darkly that the world outside was reduced to a smeared, abstract canvas of neon lights and deep shadows. Isabella sat pressed tightly against the far door, her hand still desperately clutching the canister of pepper spray in her pocket. Victor was seated on the opposite side of the wide leather bench. He paid no attention to her at all. Instead, he was focused on a tablet computer, his face illuminated by the screen's cold blue light. He appeared infuriatingly composed for someone who had just been at the center of a sidewalk gunfight. "You can let go of that spray now," Victor said, his eyes still on the screen. "If my intention was to harm you, I would have simply allowed the Meyer brothers to turn you into Swiss cheese on that sidewalk in Queens." "Why did you rescue me?" Isabella asked, her voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the violent trembling that shook her hands. "You are part of the criminal cartel that systematically destroyed my family. You were working with the Meyers." Victor finally locked his tablet and deliberately placed it on the seat between them, creating a clear barrier. He turned his body to face her directly. In the tight space of the car's interior, his presence was immense and completely overwhelming. He smelled of expensive single malt scotch and the cold steel of gun oil. "A correction is in order," Victor said, his voice low and precise. "I was contracted to handle the logistical side of your father's asset liquidation. My particular specialty is moving things, not engaging in messy corporate politics. However, when the Meyer family made the foolish decision to frame my organization for the act of arson that destroyed your family's warehouses in Hamburg, our professional partnership was immediately and permanently dissolved." Isabella's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "And you expect me to believe that you are some kind of innocent victim in all of this?" "I expect you to believe that I am a man of business," Victor replied smoothly. "And extremely bad business demands a forceful correction. The Meyers now have a substantial debt to pay me, and you, Isabella, appear to know a great deal more about whole operation more effectively than my most seasoned intelligence agents ever had." The sleek black luxury car reduced its speed, executing a flawless turn into the guarded subterranean entrance of a towering glass skyscraper that seemed to scrape the very clouds from the sky. This was the famous Kalin Tower. "Where are we?" Issa asked, her voice sharp with a growing sense of dread. "We are going to my residence," Victor answered with unnerving calm, his voice a deep resonant bass. "Because your small apartment is, at this very second, being systematically dismantled by the Mir family's professional cleaners. Any other sanctuary you might flee to, you will be found and eliminated before dawn. You are now standing directly in the calm center of the storm, Liebling." The German term of endearment, meaning darling, was delivered with a thick layer of poisonous condescension. A silent private elevator carried them swiftly to the summit of the colossal structure. The gleaming, polished metal doors parted without a sound, opening not into a corridor, but directly into a penthouse suite, so immense it felt more expansive than the entire apartment complex Issa had lived in for the last 3 years. The entire space was a stunning showcase of severe modern architecture, featuring cold, polished marble, deep-grained exotic woods, and vast floor-to-ceiling walls of seamless glass. These windows presented a breathtaking panoramic vista of the sparkling New York City skyline spread out far below them. Victor moved with the fluid, effortless grace of a predator to a fully appointed wet bar, where he poured a generous measure of a dark amber spirit into 2 crystal glasses. He held one out to her without a word. "It is a rare vintage cognac," he explained, "significantly superior to the cheap liquor you were pouring back at the Obsidian." Issa pointedly ignored the extended glass. She stood her ground in the middle of the cavernous room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as a clear sign of her defiance. "Cut the polite host act, Victor. Just tell me precisely what it is you want from me." Victor raised his own glass, taking a long, measured sip of the expensive liquor. His cold, calculating eyes never left her face, observing her over the delicately cut rim of the crystal. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration for her courage. Most individuals in her precarious position would be groveling on the floor, desperately pleading for their life or dissolving into hysterical sobs. She, however, was attempting to seize control of the situation. "I want the codes," Victor stated at last, his voice lowering to a quiet, menacing whisper that seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. Issa's entire body went taut and still. "I have absolutely no idea what you are referring to." "Do not lie to me, Isabella. It is an insult to my intelligence, and to yours." Victor began to move toward her, deliberately closing the gap between them and violating her personal space, just as he had done before in the noisy restaurant. This time, though, there was no crowd of oblivious onlookers to serve as her unintentional guardians. Your father, Heinrich, was not merely transporting consumer goods in those shipping containers. He was secretly smuggling highly encrypted server arrays on behalf of a Swiss banking consortium. When the Mir family violently seized control of his logistics company, they managed to find the physical hardware. However, they were completely unable to break through the encryption to access the sensitive data. The master encryption keys had vanished. He paused his advance, coming to a stop just a few inches from her face. Heinrich was old-fashioned. He would never trust something so vital to digital storage alone. He gave the access keys to the one person in the world he knew he could depend on without question, someone he was absolutely certain would never betray his trust, regardless of the personal risk. Issa's heart hammered against her ribs like a captured bird trying to escape its cage. She struggled to keep her face a perfect, unreadable mask of calm indifference. "I am only a waitress," she whispered, the lie sounding thin and unconvincing even to her own ears. "You are Isabella von Amsberg," Victor corrected her, his voice a low, powerful growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air that separated them. "And you are the only one who knows the location of the master ledger. The Mirs took your father's life while they were hunting for it. They have spent years systematically taking apart your life in their search for it. And just tonight, you demonstrated that you still possess access to their private operational schedules, which proves to me that you have a secret way into their secure network." He slowly lifted his hand, allowing it to hang in the air near her cheek for a long moment. She flinched away from the anticipated blow, but he did not try to harm her. Instead, his fingers gently brushed against her skin as he tucked an errant strand of her dark hair behind her ear. The calloused tips of his fingers felt unexpectedly warm against her cheek, yet the gesture itself was incredibly soft. The contradictory sensation sent an involuntary shiver of pure confusion coursing down her spine. "The Mirs are convinced you possess that ledger," Victor went on, his voice now a soft murmur. "That conviction alone is enough to make you their #1 target. But if you provide that ledger to me, I can transform it into a weapon that will absolutely annihilate them. I can unravel their financial empire and bankrupt their entire corporation by tomorrow morning. I can give you the single thing you have desperately wanted for 4 agonizing years." "And what would that be?" Issa whispered, her voice almost too quiet to hear. "Revenge." Issa held his gaze, looking directly into his eyes. They were the color of Arctic ice, sharp, cold, and utterly merciless. But reflected deep within their frozen expanse, she recognized a perfect mirror of the same intense, burning hatred that she harbored for the people who had destroyed her family and stolen her entire world. "Why on earth would I ever trust you?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. "You are a monster, Victor. You are simply a more refined monster than they are." Victor turned away from her, setting his glass down on the marble bar top. "I am a monster," he conceded, his agreement immediate and completely without shame. "However, I am a monster who meticulously honors every agreement he makes. The Mirs are fully committed to ensuring you end up dead. I am fully committed to ensuring they end up completely and utterly ruined. By definition, that makes us allies in this conflict." He strode over to the massive wall of glass, looking out at the endless stream of brilliant city lights stretching out below them. "So this is my proposal. You will live here, under my direct and personal protection. You will help me in breaking the encryption on the Mir's logistics network, using the specialized knowledge you have of your father's old security protocols. Working together, we will bring their entire empire crashing down, one painful piece at a time. When it is all over, I will provide you with $5 million and a brand new, untraceable identity. You can finally vanish from the world for good, and you will be genuinely safe at last. Issa studied the imposing silhouette of his broad shoulders against the city lights. This was, without a doubt, a pact with the devil himself. She harbored no illusions about the man she was dealing with. She was fully aware that Victor Kalin was an exceptionally dangerous man. He was a predator in every sense of the word. But she also knew that he was correct. She was so incredibly tired of hiding, so profoundly weary of living every single day in constant fear. She was exhausted down to her bones from serving drinks to arrogant, wealthy patrons while her father's killers flaunted their stolen wealth. A new sense of purpose hardening within her, she walked over to the bar and took the glass of cognac he had poured for her. She raised it to her lips and took a long, defiant drink, feeling the heat of the expensive spirit blaze a fiery trail all the way down to her stomach. 10 million, she stated, her voice surprisingly clear and firm. Victor rotated slowly to face her, a real, unguarded smile beginning to spread across his handsome face. The expression completely changed his appearance, softening his severe, angular features into something that was dangerously charismatic, almost human. I beg your pardon? $10 million, Issa said again, her voice now ringing with newfound and unshakable confidence. And I do not want them to just be bankrupt. I want their reputation completely destroyed. I want every person on this planet to know exactly what kind of animals they are and what they did to my father. Victor actually laughed. It was a dark, resonant sound that echoed in the vast, silent penthouse. You certainly drive a hard bargain, Prinzessin. That is my offer. Take it or leave it, she said, her eyes locked on his without a single flicker of doubt. Victor closed the distance between them again, extending his large hand in her direction. You have a deal. $10 million, and I will personally deliver the head of Conrad Mir to you on a silver platter. Issa paused for only a heartbeat before she put her hand into his. His grip was incredibly strong and firm, completely swallowing her much smaller hand. The handshake felt less like a simple business transaction and more like the sealing of a solemn pact that was written in blood. But I feel I should warn you, Isabella, Victor said, not letting go of her hand but instead using his grip to pull her a little closer until their bodies were almost touching. This is not some kind of game any longer. You have stepped into my world now. And in my world, once you have entered, you belong to me until every single debt has been completely settled. The air between them suddenly felt charged, crackling with an almost tangible heat. The feeling was no longer just about fear. It was an overwhelming, magnetic pull that drew them inexorably toward each other. I belong to no one, Issa shot back, wrenching her hand from his grasp even as her breathing became shallow. We shall see about that, Victor murmured, his eyes glowing with a dark promise. At that exact moment, the soft chime of the elevator doors arriving echoed through the penthouse. Stefan, Victor's most trusted subordinate, burst into the room, his face ashen and his expression filled with alarm. Boss, Stefan gasped, his voice tight with panic. We have a major problem. The police just sent out an all-points bulletin. For who? Victor demanded, his voice sharp with irritation at the sudden interruption. For her, Stefan answered, raising a shaking hand and pointing directly at Issa. The Mirs did more than just send a hit squad after her tonight. They have also managed to frame her for murder. They planted the weapon that was used to kill a police officer in Queens 3 weeks ago, somewhere inside her apartment. They are manipulating the entire story. Issa Corwin is not a waitress anymore. As far as the New York Police Department is concerned, she is now a wanted fugitive and a cop killer. Issa let out a choked gasp of disbelief. The heavy crystal tumbler slipped from her suddenly numb fingers, falling to the polished stone floor, where it exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. Victor's handsome face hardened, his expression becoming as cold and unforgiving as chiseled stone. "They are attempting to force her out into the open," he said, his voice a low growl of controlled fury. "If the authorities succeed in taking her into custody, she will be dead in less than an hour." He turned his gaze back to Issa, and his eyes were now burning with a frightening new intensity. "Welcome to the war, Isabella. From this moment on, there is no escape and no turning back for you." For the following 3 weeks, the entire world beyond the protective walls of Colin Tower became a relentless hunting ground for Isa Corwin, the woman now infamous as the fugitive cop killer. Her photograph was everywhere, plastered across the screen of every television news broadcast and shining down from every massive digital billboard. Her name became a constant scrolling headline at the bottom of the giant screens that illuminated Times Square. But inside the penthouse high above the city, she remained an untouchable ghost. On the 45th floor, time itself seemed to twist around them. The lavish apartment had become a command center, a war room overlooking the city. A magnificent dining table, carved from a single piece of rare Italian marble, was now completely invisible, buried under a mountain of schematics, digital server logs, and stacks of old shipping manifests. Issa had pieced these documents together from the fragments of her own memory. Sleep had become a stranger to her for days. Her eyes were framed by deep red circles of exhaustion, and her skin was pale from the constant absence of sunlight. She sat cross-legged on the plush carpet, adrift in a sea of scattered papers. She wore only one of Victor's oversized white dress shirts, the fabric hanging loosely down to her knees, making her look small and incredibly vulnerable. Victor remained perfectly still by the window, his gaze fixed on the relentless rain that lashed against the thick, soundproof glass. The sprawling city below blurred into a watercolor painting, its bright light slowly dissolving in the gray storm. He finally tore his eyes away from the scene to look at her. The sight of Issa, draped in his own clothes, so small and intensely focused amidst the organized chaos of their work, caused a strange tightening in his chest. It was an unfamiliar, protective feeling he had not allowed himself to experience in many, many years. He was no longer just guarding a valuable asset, he was protecting her. He knew this with a terrifying certainty, and that simple realization scared him more than any assassin's bullet ever could. "You need to eat something," Victor said, his voice emerging rougher than he had intended. He crossed the room and gently placed a small plate of fruit, cheese on the floor beside her, careful not to disturb her work. Issa did not even look up from the laptop screen. "I am close, Victor. I can feel it in my bones. The encryption on the Mir servers is not just a random string of code. It is a clever variation of a Polybius square, but it has been modified in a personal way." She paused for a moment. "My father used to teach me ciphers and codes when I was a little girl. He always made it seem like some kind of elaborate, wonderful game." She began tapping a pencil against her lower lip, a nervous habit he had now come to memorize and anticipate with a strange fondness. "The key? It has to be something emotional, something deeply personal. Heinrich never trusted machines with the things that truly mattered to him. He trusted memory." Victor sat down on the floor, directly opposite her. The great Mafia Don, a man who commanded fear and respect, was sitting on the expensive carpet like a patient schoolboy. "What do you remember about the day he first gave you the access codes?" Issa closed her eyes, letting her mind drift back, searching through the years of carefully buried memories. "It was my 18th birthday. We were in his private library back in our home in Zurich. He put on a record, Wagner. I remember the music swelling in the room. He told me, 'Isabella, chaos is the true music of the world, but logic is the rhythm that gives it meaning.'" Her eyes snapped open, wide with a sudden, brilliant understanding. The rhythm! Of course. It is the time signature of the music he was playing. She grabbed a nearby laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a renewed, ferocious speed. Victor watched her, completely mesmerized by the intensity of her focus. He realized in that moment that she was not just beautiful, she was absolutely lethal. Her brilliant mind was a weapon, a dangerous tool that had been tragically hidden away under a waitress's cheap, worn-out apron for far too long. A bright green progress bar suddenly flashed to life on the laptop screen, filling rapidly. Below it, two simple words appeared in stark white font. Access granted. Issa let out a sharp, sudden gasp, the sound cutting through the quiet tension of the room. "I am in," she whispered in utter disbelief. "I have everything. The Mir family's hidden shadow accounts, all of the illegal arms deals, the human trafficking routes. I even have the extensive records of bribes paid to federal judges. It is all right here." She finally raised her head to meet Victor's intense stare, her eyes glistening with a powerful combination of absolute victory and the tears she refused to let fall. "We got them," she announced, her voice trembling slightly. "Every last one of them is ours." But Victor was not looking at the glowing monitor that displayed their success. His entire focus was consumed by her face, by the raw emotion he saw there. In that instant, the pure, uncut adrenaline of their shared triumph finally burned away the distance that had kept them apart. He reached for her, his large, capable hands moving with surprising gentleness to frame her face. His thumbs traced the exhausted, dark smudges beneath her eyes, softly wiping them away. "You did this," he murmured, his voice heavy and thick with an awe she had never heard before. "No," she whispered back, her own breath catching as he drew even nearer. "We did this together." The very atmosphere in the room seemed to thicken, buzzing with the unspoken energy of an impending storm. The fragile peace between them shattered into 1,000 pieces. Victor's attention narrowed, his dark gaze now tracing the soft, full curve of her bottom lip with an unnerving intensity. A primal hunger awakened deep inside him, a powerful and consuming urge to finally claim her, to completely erase every thought from her mind but him. And yet, he restrained himself, allowing the space between their bodies to crackle with that powerful, unspoken promise. "If I start this," Victor warned, his voice a deep growl that carried the scent of sweet destruction, "we will not be able to stop." He needed her to understand the stakes completely. The moment we cross this line, our partnership is finished. It will be something else entirely. But Eisler did not flinch. She did not step back. Instead, she erased the final inch of distance between them, leaning into his hard, unyielding body. Her hand came up, moving with a slow, deliberate grace, and pressed firmly against his chest, right over the steady, powerful beat of his heart. Under her palm, she could feel the relentless, pounding rhythm of his heart, a primal drumbeat in a corrupt world that was built on lies and deceit. "I don't want to go back," she confessed in a quiet whisper, a statement that sealed her fate and his. That was all the confirmation Victor needed. With a low groan, he eliminated the last inch of distance separating them. The kiss was not soft or tentative in any way. It was a violent, shattering impact, a desperate reckoning between two souls who had been starved of anything genuine for far too long. It was a brutal, claiming act, fueled by a searing heat that threatened to burn them both to ash. Issa's fingers twisted into the thick, dark hair at the back of his neck, pulling him down, using him as an anchor as the opulent room dissolved into a blur around them. In that single, stolen moment, the world and all its dangers fell away. He was not a crime lord. She was not a woman on the run from the law. For one fleeting, perfect moment, they were only Victor and Isabella, completely lost in each other. But the fragile illusion was shattered by the harsh, insistent buzz of Victor's secure phone on the nearby table. He pulled away from her reluctantly, resting his forehead against hers for a long second, his breath coming in ragged, heavy bursts. He swore viciously under his breath in German and snatched the phone from the tabletop. "Report," he commanded, his voice a low, menacing growl. Stefan's voice came through the encrypted line, strained and filled with urgency. Boss, we have a serious problem. The data you just accessed tripped a silent alarm deep within their system. The Myers know someone breached their servers. Their technicians are working to trace the IP address right now as we speak. Disconnect the proxy server immediately, Victor ordered, getting to his feet and pulling Isabella up beside him in one fluid motion. How long before they find our physical location? There is no time, Stefan answered, his voice grim. But that is not even the worst part. Conrad Meyer just gave the executive order for Protocol Zero. He is scrubbing the servers completely clean. He intends to remotely delete everything within the next 2 hours. If that data is destroyed, all of our hard-won evidence simply vanishes with it. We cannot leak proof to the world that no longer exists. Isabella's face turned ashen, the color draining from her cheeks. He is wiping the off-site cloud backups too. Everything will be gone. Is there any possible way to stop it? Victor asked, turning to face her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hope. Isabella shook her head, her movements becoming frantic with panic. Not from here. The access I gained is read-only. To halt a Protocol Zero wipe, I need to provide full biometric authorization on their system. It requires a direct retinal scan and a voice print confirmation. Whose biometrics? Victor demanded, his tone sharp. My father's, she said, her voice catching with emotion. Or his direct bloodline. Her eyes widened as she looked at Victor, the terrible, impossible realization dawning on both of them at the exact same time. Me? I have to physically be there to authorize the command to stop the wipe. But the only terminal with that level of administrative override is located deep inside the Meyer private server room. Where is that room located? The vault, Isabella answered, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the task ahead. It is located in a secure facility directly beneath the Maritime Exchange building. Victor glanced down at his expensive watch, his expression grim and set like stone. Tonight is the annual Maritime Charity Ball. The entire exchange will be absolutely swarming with private security, politicians, and at least half of the Meyer family will be in attendance. Then we have to go to the ball, Isabella said, her voice suddenly solid, infused with a newfound, unyielding steel. I must get into that server room before those 2 hours are up. There is no other way. Victor looked at her, standing there in nothing but his shirt, disheveled and a fugitive who was wanted for murder. Then he saw the unyielding fire burning in her eyes, and his mind was made up. Stefan, Victor spoke clearly into the phone, his decision made in an instant. Get the car ready, and bring the special package I had sent over from Milan. We are going out tonight. The Maritime Exchange building was less a building and more a modern fortress, masquerading as a grand palace of high society. Gilded gold leaf climbed its massive, imposing columns, and enormous crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung like frozen waterfalls from the vaulted ceilings. Inside, the grand ballroom was a churning, chaotic sea of expensive tuxedos and breathtaking designer gowns. It was a swirling vortex of New York's most powerful elite, all of them sipping champagne that was paid for with blood money and dark secrets. At the grand entrance, the security was, predictably, extremely intense. There were industrial-grade metal detectors, rigorous identification checks, and a sophisticated facial recognition system that was directly linked to the federal police database. A sleek black limousine slid to a silent stop at the curb, and a valet in a crisp uniform hurried to open the rear door. Victor Kalin emerged from the vehicle. He was the very picture of an underworld king, dressed in a bespoke tuxedo that seemed molded to his broad shoulders like a piece of finely crafted armor. He casually buttoned his jacket, his handsome face a perfect mask of bored, untouchable arrogance. He then turned and extended a gloved hand to the woman who was still inside the car. Isabella stepped out, and a palpable wave of silence rippled through the onlookers and the gathered press. She was nothing short of magnificent, a vision of dangerous beauty. She wore an elegant gown of midnight blue silk that clung to every single one of her curves, featuring a daringly high slit that climbed her thigh and a back that plunged to a dangerously low point. Diamonds, which had once belonged to Victor's own mother, sparkled like captured stars at her throat and ears, catching the light with every movement. But it was her face that truly completed the stunning transformation. Her hair had been professionally dyed a brilliant platinum blonde and was styled in glamorous old Hollywood waves that cascaded over one shoulder. Her makeup was expertly applied, sharp, dramatic, and unforgettable. Her face was a clever lie, subtly reshaped with technology to deceive a camera, but not a person standing close. In her hand, she held an ornate Venetian mask, a perfect accessory for the evening's theme, the masquerade of the sea. Power, she knew, was the ultimate protection, and tonight she would see if she had enough. "Are you ready?" Victor's voice was a low murmur, his hand resting with a clear sense of ownership on the curve of her spine. "I was born for this," Isabella answered, but her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild bird desperate for escape. Together, they walked up the red carpet, projecting an image of untouchable confidence. A guard in a crisp uniform stepped into their path, lifting a scanner. "Name?" he asked, his voice completely devoid of emotion. The guard's tone was flat and bored. "Victor Kalin," Victor replied, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "And my guest, the Countess von Habsburg." The guard hesitated for a fraction of a second, a small crack appearing in his professional armor. Victor saw it instantly. He moved his hand, and a heavy gold-plated coin discreetly found its way into the guard's waiting palm. It was a well-known marker from the syndicate, a symbol of immense power. The guard's eyes fell to the coin, then snapped back up to meet Victor's cold, steady gaze. The message was clear. Without another word, he lowered the scanner, never once looking at Isabella's identification. "Enjoy your evening, sir." Just like that, they were past the first gate. The ballroom was an assault on the senses, thick with heat and the roar of conversation. Isabella kept her mask firmly in place. She lifted the mask to her face, her eyes sweeping the room with cold, methodical precision. It took only a moment to find Conrad Meyer. He was the center of a laughing circle near the orchestra, a glass of dark amber scotch held loosely in one hand. He was completely at ease, a king in his castle, as if he had not tried to have her killed just 3 weeks ago. "The server room is in the sub-basement," Isabella whispered, her voice nearly lost as Victor guided her into the slow rhythm of a dance. "The only way to get inside is through the service elevator, and that is located in the kitchen." "I will create a spectacle for you," Victor promised, pulling her closer, his possessiveness a strange comfort. "You will have exactly 10 minutes. After that, the data wipe becomes permanent. Stefan has already taken care of the security cameras in the main hallway for you. But you must understand, the server room itself operates on a closed offline network. The moment you are inside that room, you will be utterly and completely alone." "I can do it," Isabella said, her voice filled with a conviction she desperately wanted to feel. Victor spun her in a graceful arc, dipping her low so her hair almost brushed the polished floor. In the very heart of the swirling, crowded dance floor, he stared down into her eyes. "I know you can. But listen to me. If you are caught, do not wait. You run." He raised her gloved hand to his lips and pressed a kiss there, a silent promise, and then he let her go. Isabella immediately turned and vanished into the sea of guests, moving with a sharp and focused purpose toward the kitchen doors. Victor smoothed his cufflinks, took a deep breath, and began to walk straight toward Conrad Meyer. Isabella moved through the loud, chaotic kitchen like a ghost. The staff, frantic and overwhelmed with plating hundreds of orders of lobster thermidor, were far too busy to see a woman in a shimmering ball gown glide silently into the industrial freight elevator. She used a stolen keycard, one Victor had somehow managed to secure for her. The heavy metal doors groaned and slid shut with a heavy, final thud. Her isolation was complete. She pressed the button labeled sub-basement. With a low mechanical groan, the elevator started its slow journey down into the earth. Isabella glanced at her watch. The countdown had begun. Only 6 minutes were left on the clock. The doors finally shuddered open, revealing a long, sterile corridor painted a blinding white. At the very end of the hall stood a massive door made of solid steel. It was the vault. Without a single moment of hesitation, Isabella ran toward it. A biometric scanner glowed next to the handle. She ripped off her elegant glove and pressed the bare skin of her palm firmly against the cool glass plate. A calm, computerized voice echoed in the silent hall. Scanning. Authorization confirmed. Welcome, Isabella von Amsberg. With a series of loud metallic clanks, the heavy locking bolts retracted. Isabella threw all her weight against the heavy door, pushed it open, and rushed inside to the She stopped and stared at the main console, and a cold dread washed over her as her heart sank. A violent red light pulsed across the wide screen, an alarm screaming a message of total failure. Deletion in progress. 85% of the data was already gone forever. She launched herself into the operator's chair, her fingers flying across the keyboard in a desperate blur. She could feel each precious second ticking away, slipping through her grasp. Please, please, just work, she pleaded silently, as she slammed the command for a complete system override. A cold, synthesized voice filled the silent room. Voice authorization required. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Isabella von Amsberg spoke her own name with perfect ringing clarity. Authorization code Alpha Omega Zurich. An endless silent pause stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then the voice returned. Voice confirmed. Deletion paused, recovering data. The suffocating tension finally broke and she fell back into the chair, letting out a single, ragged breath that she felt like she had been holding for the last 4 agonizing years. The screen glowed with a beautiful, reassuring green light. The lost files were rebuilding themselves, line by painful line of code. With hands that trembled, she slid the encrypted hard drive Victor had given her into the open port. The data transfer protocol immediately initiated. "You are such a clever girl," a calm, amused voice said from the entrance to the room. Isabella whipped around in her chair, a paralyzing, icy cold flooding her entire body. Conrad Meyer was standing there. He was casually holding a pistol, a long suppressor screwed onto its barrel. He was supposed to be upstairs, distracted by Victor. He was supposed to be contained. She had been completely, utterly, and fatally wrong. The man in the ballroom must have been a look-alike, a body double. Or perhaps Conrad had simply slipped away the very moment Victor began his approach. "Did you honestly believe you could just walk into my house and steal my most valuable secrets?" Conrad sneered, stepping all the way into the room. He looked her up and down. "You look so much like your father. You have the same arrogance, and in a moment, you are about to be just as dead." Isabella scrambled backward until her back hit the cold metal of the towering server racks. The download progress bar was only at 60%. She had to find a way to buy more time. "You killed him," she said, her voice shaking with a deep, consuming rage she had held inside for years. "You did not just steal his company from him. You murdered my father in cold blood." "He was weak," Conrad answered with a dismissive, careless shrug of his shoulders as he raised the pistol. "Business is a world that belongs to the strong, Isabella. You should know that. And you are nothing but a loose end that I now have to tie up." He aimed the barrel of the gun directly at the center of her chest. There was a loud bang. The sound of the shot was deafening in the small enclosed space. Isabella flinched violently, squeezing her eyes shut, her entire body bracing for the searing, unimaginable pain. But the pain never arrived. She slowly, cautiously opened her eyes. Conrad Meyer was still standing in the same spot, but a look of complete and utter shock was now etched onto his face. A small dark red flower of blood was rapidly spreading across the fabric of his expensive suit jacket, blooming on his shoulder. His gun dropped from his limp fingers and clattered loudly onto the floor as he stumbled backward. Standing behind him, perfectly framed in the doorway with a smoking pistol in his hand, was Victor. His expensive tuxedo was torn at the shoulder, and his lower lip was split and bleeding. It was clear he had fought his way down here to reach her. "I told you," Victor growled, stepping over Conrad's writhing, gasping body as if he were nothing more than a piece of trash. "She belongs to me." Victor did not even bother to look down at Conrad. His intense eyes were locked on Isabella. "Is it done?" he demanded. "Almost," she said, her hands shaking so badly she could barely speak as she pointed a trembling finger toward the screen. 90%. Conrad groaned from his place on the cold floor, clutching desperately at his wounded shoulder. "You are both fools," he wheezed, struggling to draw air into his lungs. "Do you actually think you can just walk out of here? I triggered the silent alarm the very moment the vault was opened. The police are already here, sealing off this entire building from top to bottom. You are trapped." Victor walked with a calm, unhurried pace over to the console. He cleanly pulled the drive out just as the progress bar on the screen hit 100%. He slid the small device securely into the inner pocket of his jacket. "We are not trapped," Victor said, his voice low and dangerous. He reached for Isabella's hand, grabbing it and pulling her along with him. "We are leaving." "But how?" Isabella asked, her mind racing. The distant sound of sirens was growing louder, wailing from the street level far above them. "The elevators will be completely locked down by now." Victor moved to the center of the room and kicked open a large, heavy grate set into the floor. The opening revealed a dark, damp tunnel that stretched out into complete blackness. It was an old smuggler's passage from the Prohibition era, a forgotten secret that connected this building to the city's subway system. "We go down," Victor said simply, gesturing into the deep darkness. He looked at her then, his blue eyes fierce and unwavering in the dim light. "Do you trust me?" Isabella looked at this complicated man who had mocked her, saved her life, and now had killed for her. She saw the fresh, raw blood on his knuckles and the absolute burning devotion in his eyes. "With my life," she replied, and there was not a single moment of hesitation in her voice. Together they leaped down into the darkness, leaving the glittering, crumbling empire of the Myers to collapse behind them, just as a heavily armed police tactical team breached the server room doors high above. The tunnel was filled with the foul smell of stagnant water and old, decaying rust. For what felt like a lifetime, Victor and Isabella stumbled and pushed their way through the pitch-black passage. The sounds of the chaos at the Maritime Exchange slowly began to fade away, becoming a dull, distant thrum above their heads. Victor kept a firm, steadying hand on Isabella's arm, expertly guiding her through the suffocating darkness. She noticed his other hand was pressed tightly to his side, where a long graze from a ricocheting bullet, one she had been too consumed by adrenaline to even notice in the server room, was bleeding slowly but steadily. They finally emerged into the crisp, cool night air, finding themselves standing beneath the massive, shadowy support pillars of the Brooklyn Bridge. The dark river water lapped rhythmically against the concrete below, looking as black and oily as spilled ink in the dim moonlight. "Stefan is 5 minutes out," Victor rasped, his voice strained as he checked his watch. He leaned heavily against one of the concrete pillars, his face looking ghostly pale under the moon. "We did it." Isabella clutched the drive in her pocket, the small device feeling incredibly heavy. "Not yet," she countered. "Having the information is only the first step. Figuring out how to use it without getting us both killed is the real challenge." A sleek black speedboat cut through the dark water, its powerful engine a low, menacing purr. Stefan was at the helm. He skillfully guided the boat to a rusted service ladder, and they scrambled quickly and quietly aboard. As the boat accelerated away from the shore, racing toward the vast open ocean and leaving the frantic, screaming sirens of Manhattan far behind them, Isabella looked back one last time at the glittering, indifferent skyline. She had her revenge. Now it was time to get justice. This was not a retreat. This was a counter-offensive, meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed. She was not running. She was simply redeploying her forces for the final battle. Exactly 3 days after she vanished without a trace, the world woke up to a digital firestorm. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, a data bomb detonated across the global network, landing in the secure inboxes of every major news organization from New York to London to Zurich. This was far more than a simple document leak. It was an overwhelming tidal wave of irrefutable proof. The Amsberg files contained terabytes of evidence, high-definition video, crystal-clear audio recordings, and damning financial ledgers that could not be denied. The footage showed Konrad Mir, his face a mask of cold fury, giving the direct order to burn the von Amsberg warehouses to the ground. It laid bare the intricate web of electronic fund transfers that flowed directly to a corrupt precinct captain. This was the very same police captain who had personally entered Isla's small apartment and planted the unregistered firearm, the piece of false evidence designed to frame her and silence her forever. The data dump also included shocking dashboard camera footage from a vehicle in the Mir convoy. This footage clearly revealed that Mir's own men were the ones who had tragically struck and killed the police officer in Queens during their pursuit. This was the exact crime for which Ela had been so publicly and falsely accused, her face plastered across every news channel as a fugitive. Meanwhile, Isla herself sat in perfect, controlled stillness within a secure safe house. It was a stunningly modern villa, all glass and steel, perched on a secluded private island off the rugged coast of Maine. She watched the chaos she had unleashed unfold on a massive television screen. "Breaking news," the anchor stammered, his voice trembling as his face went pale with shock. "Federal agents have just stormed the Mir family estate in the Hamptons. Konrad Mir, who is currently hospitalized and under a heavy armed guard, has been officially charged by federal prosecutors. The indictment includes racketeering, murder, and high treason." The treason charge, the anchor explained, stemmed from the illegal sale of military-grade encryption technology to hostile foreign governments. Furthermore, he continued, all charges against Isla Corwin, who has now been correctly identified as the missing heiress Isabella von Amsberg, have been immediately and completely dropped by the district attorney's office. With a quiet, satisfying click, Isla turned off the television. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute, a heavy blanket of finality that settled over everything. It was done. It was finally over. The monster who had stalked her waking moments and haunted her dreams was now locked in a cage of his own making. She heard the soft, familiar sound of footsteps approaching from behind. It was Victor standing silently in the doorway. He was standing in the entrance to the living area, a silhouette against the hall light. He had cleaned himself up since their escape, but his movements were still stiff and carefully measured, a clear sign of the injury he had sustained. He wore an impeccably tailored dark suit and held a thick manila envelope in one hand. "The helicopter is waiting for you," Victor said. His voice was completely stripped of emotion, as flat and final as if he were closing a complex business transaction. "It is scheduled to take you to Boston. From there, a private jet is fully fueled and prepared for a direct flight to Zurich." He crossed the polished floor and deliberately placed the envelope on the low coffee table between them. "Inside, you will find your new passport, along with the original property deed to your father's old estate. I took the liberty of purchasing it back from the bank this morning." He paused for a moment. "There is also a certified check for $10 million. Our agreement has been fulfilled." Isla's gaze slowly shifted from the thick envelope, the physical manifestation of her old life, to his impassive, unreadable face. "And that is it?" she asked, her voice quiet. "The transaction is now complete?" A small muscle twitched in Victor's jaw, the only sign of the tension beneath his controlled exterior. "You said you wanted your life back, Isabella. Now you have it. The entire Mir organization is being systematically dismantled as we speak. Your name has been cleared worldwide. You are, once again, an incredibly wealthy and powerful woman. My world is no place for you. You saw firsthand what happened at the charity ball. It is a world filled with blood, bullets, and dark, forgotten tunnels. That is not a life. That is a prison sentence. He began to turn away from her then, finding it physically impossible to meet her intense gaze any longer. Go back to the light, princess, he said, his back now to her. Go back to your world and forget you ever descended into the darkness and met a man like me. Isla rose slowly to her feet, moving with a newfound grace and an unshakable sense of purpose. She calmly picked up the thick envelope from the table, feeling its weight in her hand. Victor. He paused at the sound of her voice but did not turn around. You speak absolutely excellent German, she said, her voice shifting smoothly into his native tongue, her accent utterly flawless and pure. But you still understand absolutely nothing about women. At that, Victor finally turned around, slowly, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Isla walked deliberately over to the large stone fireplace, where a low, steady fire was burning, casting dancing shadows across the room. She held the envelope out over the licking flames. What do you think you are doing? Victor's voice was sharp, a crack in his armor of indifference. His eyes were wide with shock. She simply opened her hand and let the envelope go. The fire eagerly consumed the paper, devouring the passport, the deed, and the $10 million check in a matter of seconds. The promises of her old life, of safety and wealth, curled into blackened, insignificant ash. I do not want the money, Isla said, stepping over the ashes to stand directly in front of him, closing the distance between them. And I have no desire to go back to Zurich. There is nothing left for me there except for ghosts and the painful memories of a life that was stolen from me. Then what is it that you want? Victor demanded, his legendary self-control finally beginning to crack and crumble. Do you want to go back to being a waitress? Do you want to spend the rest of your nights refilling water glasses for minimum wage and hollow tips? No, Isla said softly, her voice unwavering. She reached out with one hand and straightened his expensive silk tie, her fingers lingering for just a moment against the fabric. I realized something very important while I was trapped in that server room. My father was a good man, a very good man, but he was ultimately weak. He was weak because he always insisted on fighting his battles completely alone. You are a powerful man, Victor, she continued, but you are completely hollow inside for the exact same reason. You fight alone. She looked directly up into his piercing, ice-blue eyes, holding his gaze without flinching. I do not want to be a waitress, and I certainly refuse to ever be a victim again. I want to be a partner. Victor just stared at her, completely caught off guard, his mind reeling. The silence between them stretched out, becoming heavy and electric with unspoken possibilities and the weight of her declaration. You have to understand what you are asking for, he finally said, his voice low and strained. There is no retirement plan in this life. There are no happy endings, only final ones. I do not want a happy ending, Isla whispered, her voice filled with a powerful conviction that shook him to his core. I want a real one. She rose on her toes and kissed him. This kiss was nothing like the first desperate, frantic one they had shared. This kiss was a promise. It was the final seal on a contract far more binding and valuable than any amount of money. In that single moment, all of Victor's carefully constructed defenses shattered into a million pieces. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tightly against him, as if he were trying to merge their very souls into one unbreakable whole. Stefan is going to be absolutely furious, he murmured against her hair, the faintest hint of a smile touching his voice. He is thoroughly convinced that you are a terrible influence on me. Isla laughed, and the sound was bright, clear, and wonderfully free. Well, she said, pulling back just enough to look at him, Stefan can get his own coffee from now on. 1 month later, on a vibrant Friday night, the Obsidian Lounge was electric with a palpable energy. Every single table was booked solid, the air buzzing with conversation and the clinking of glasses. Suddenly, the large front door swung open, and a profound hush fell over the entire room, conversations dying mid-sentence. Victor Kalin walked in, looking as dangerous and regal as a king surveying his domain. But tonight, he was not alone. On his arm was a woman in a breathtaking crimson dress that seemed to command the attention of everyone present. Her dark hair was swept across her shoulders, and she held her head high with an air of unshakable confidence that was mesmerizing. The patrons whispered amongst themselves, their eyes wide. They all recognized her face from the constant, obsessive news coverage. She was the heiress, the woman who had single-handedly brought down the entire mere criminal empire. A host immediately escorted them to table 4, the very same corner table where Victor had so cruelly mocked a simple, unassuming waitress just a few short weeks ago. Arthur, the perpetually nervous and sweating manager, hurried over to them. He clutched the heavy wine list with hands that trembled visibly under the dim, atmospheric lights. "Mr. Kalin, Miss von Amsberg," he stammered. "Welcome back to the lounge. We are truly, truly honored to have you." Isla looked at Arthur for a long, silent moment, her gaze steady. Then her eyes shifted to the terrified young waitress standing just behind him, a girl who looked utterly exhausted. Her apron was stained with the evening's work, and her feet were likely throbbing in pain, inside a pair of cheap, uncomfortable heels. Isla recognized the look in her eyes all too well. Gently, she took the wine list from Arthur's trembling hands and passed it to the young waitress. "Take the rest of the night off," Isla said, her voice soft, but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "In fact, you should take the entire week off, with full pay." Arthur sputtered, his face a mask of utter confusion and panic. But I cannot just—" Isla's voice turned cool and commanding, cutting him off. "I own the building now, Arthur, and I can assure you, from this moment on, things are going to change around here. We will start with how you treat your staff." She then turned back to Victor, who was watching the entire exchange with a look of pure, unadulterated pride on his face. "So," she asked him, a playful smirk touching the corners of her lips, "what do you have to say for yourself now? Not too bad for someone who is completely empty on the inside, right?" Victor lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a warm kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "Niemals Lear, meine Königin," he replied softly in German, his voice rich with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "You were never empty, my queen. I was simply too blind to see you." Isla smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. She raised her glass in a silent toast. Together, they had burned the old world down to the ground, and from its ashes, they were building a new one. And this time, she was not the one serving the wine. She was the one calling all the shots. And that is the incredible story of Isla and Victor. Their journey together began with a cruel, careless insult, spoken in a language he wrongly and arrogantly assumed she could not possibly understand. It concluded with her completely rewriting the rules of the entire unforgiving game he had mastered. It just goes to show that you should never, ever judge a person by the uniform they wear or their perceived position in life. Victor thought he was looking down on a powerless, insignificant servant. In reality, he was looking at a fierce survivor, a queen in disguise. He was looking at a woman who had learned how to turn her deepest trauma into an unstoppable weapon and transform her pained silence into a mighty roar that was loud enough to bring down a criminal empire. So now I have to ask you, what did you really think about Isla's final move? Was taking the $10 million and vanishing into a quiet, anonymous life the smart play? Or did she make the absolute right call by staying to forge an entirely new empire right alongside Victor? I am dying to know what you think, so make sure you drop your opinions in the comments section below. If you got invested in this saga of carefully planned revenge, a romance that bloomed in the face of danger, and the ultimate fight for justice, then please do me a huge favor and smash that like button. Send this video to anyone you know who loves a good story, And most importantly, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that little notification bell so you are the first to know when a new story goes live.